seems like a miracle to me. So I'm optimistic on that front, certainly.
O Alexandre tem uma pergunta.
Os seus livros todos, eles lidam com mais de uma disciplina. O Emergência, que é um dos livros dele, fala de sociedade das formigas, funcionamento do cérebro, como as cidades crescem e o desenvolvimento. Mas todos eles acabam falando um pouco da transição da era industrial para a era digital. Eu queria saber se esse aspecto multidisciplinar, ele é imprescindível na era digital. Você tem que saber transitar entre diferentes assuntos.
It's always been just a great passion of mine to try and connect all these different worlds.
Yeah.
And I was, in a sense, I was trained in the humanities, you know, as a kind of a media critic, and then as somebody who was studying basically the 19th century novel in grad school. And what I found as I was doing all these things is I was, in my free time, reading all these books about science and technology. And at that point, in the late 80s and early 90s, there was in the academic world, in the kind of intellectual world, in the States at least, there was a giant battle between the humanities and the sciences. And deconstruction, the big kind of fashion intellectually in the humanities, and if they talked about science, it was to deconstruct them and to show how they actually weren't true and how they revealed all these hidden biases. And so the scientists hated that, and they thought that they were just being attacked constantly from the humanities side. And it had always occurred to me that there was actually a lot of very interesting things that you could do if you actually had those two groups talk to each other. And so the repeating kind of pattern in all the books, really, one way or another, is to try and kind of bridge that gap and to get these different disciplines to talk to each other. Because I've always felt that, if for instance, if you think about, McLuhan has a famous line about media, which is that basically all forms of media are an extension of our central nervous system, right? And every media theorist ever since McLuhan has kind of taken that line and said, I'm going to think more about media in that way and how it changes our perception of the world. And what I've always thought is, if you're going to take that insight, which I think is a profound insight, you have to also understand how the central nervous system, right? You have to have a theory of how the brain works and a theory of how media works, and you have to be able to have those two theories talk to each other in some basic way. And so, all along with all the books, I've been trying to kind of bridge those gaps. In the cholera book, there's all this stuff about Dickens, because Dickens is central to that kind of period of time in the way that London kind of made sense of itself in the mid-1850s, and you can't tell a kind of a scientific story of what was happening in an epidemic in London in the poverty of that city at that point without somehow filtering it through the experience the way that Dickens kind of packaged it. So yeah, that movement across those different disciplines and from the sciences into the humanities and back, and to bring technology into it, that's my favorite thing about what I do.
Há um terceiro elemento aí que não aparece nos teus livros, que é a questão que também ele vive em conflito com esses dois outros, que é a ciência e a área de humanas, que é a espiritualidade. Você tem algum interesse nisso? Você já pensou em escrever sobre o lado espiritual nessa transição de eras da industrial para o digital que a gente está vivendo hoje?
It's funny. I'm working on that right now. Actually, you should ask. You noticed that there was something missing. I'm writing a book that actually this is the first time I've ever talked about it publicly. Hey, it's a scoop. That is focused ostensibly on Joseph Priestley, the late 1800s kind of scientist, political theorist, and religious reformer. Co-founded Unitarianism. And this one breakthrough scientific insight he had, which is that plants are actually creating oxygen. Like, he was the first person who realized that oxygen was not just something sitting around populating the air, but it was something that was actually being created by other organisms. And it's one of those breakthrough ideas that, an entire way of thinking about life comes out of that kind of little experiment. So I'm focused on that one. It's showing the kind of ripple effects of Priestley's life and his way of thinking about the world. And he was someone who managed to reconcile religion and science in this very interesting way. And the thing that finally got me into this idea of this book is that it turns out he had a huge impact on Thomas Jefferson, our third president's view of the world, and particularly his view of religion. And Jefferson went to his grave saying that if it hadn't been for Priestley's writing, he would have not been a Christian. He would have abandoned Christianity altogether. So we would have had basically a kind of an agnostic third president of the United States had it not been for this, amazing kind of fusion of science and spirituality that Priestley figured out. I'm not a kind of a religious person in an orthodox way, but I've been very moved by stuff that E.O. Wilson has written, the American scientist, about what he sometimes calls biophilia, which is the kind of spiritual feeling of connection to nature that human beings have. And there's some argument that religious kind of values may in part come out of that kind of innate propensity to find kind of spiritual attachment to the environment you inhabit. That there's an evolutionary reason why we have that, so that we protect our environment, and that as a culture we built more elaborate religious kind of systems on top of that. So I am interested in that, and I've kind of dodged it over the last 5 books, but I'm running squarely into the belly of the beast with this new one.
Eu queria aproveitar o gancho, se possível, para não perder o ponto, porque você, claro, deve conhecer o livro do Ray Kurzweil, A Era das Máquinas Espirituais. Tem bastante a ver com o que a gente está falando agora. E, bom, nesse livro, eu não sei se todo mundo conhece, mas ele faz uma extrapolação da velocidade com que os computadores estão se miniaturizando e ficando cada vez mais potentes e rápidos, e prevê que por volta de 2030 um computador vai ter o mesmo nível de inteligência do ser humano, e a partir daí ele prevê uma espécie de convergência entre as máquinas e a inteligência artificial e a inteligência biológica, né? Você com certeza conhece bastante isso. Ao mesmo tempo, eu tive um debate muito grande sobre essa ideia com uma amiga budista, né, que dizia que isso não seria possível, porque mesmo que a máquina fosse inteligente, ela não teria a centelha do espírito ou qualquer coisa desse tipo. Como é que você vê essas ideias do Kurzweil e como é que você vê essa possibilidade de que nós, enquanto inteligência biológica, temos como missão na Terra criar uma inteligência artificial para que ela possa conquistar o universo?
The problem with Kurzweil's argument, and I have to say I loved that book, and I read it in about 3 minutes. I mean, it's just he is so interesting and provocative. But it is largely predicated on a kind of a pure computational idea of intelligence and consciousness and spirituality. The brain is just a big computer, and it just has a certain number of kind of nodes that are interconnected with each other, and there's no doubt that, given everything we know about the history of technology, that computers are going to get to that level of interconnectedness. 2030, 2040, who knows exactly what it will be, but we will have that number of, in a sense, the network will be that complex on a computer. But the problem is, nobody really knows what consciousness is. I mean, I wrote a whole book, Mind Wide Open, about the brain, and I said right at the beginning, I said, I'm not going to get into the question of consciousness because it is so hard to figure out, and nobody's agreed on it. We've agreed on a lot of other things about how the brain works. But our awareness of what's happening, our awareness of ourself, the kind of tactile feeling of the world is something we just fundamentally have guesses about right now. And there are some people who think that that is just what happens when you plug all those nodes together. You get to scale, and spirituality and consciousness just pops out. And, they may be right. I truly don't know. I don't understand enough about the brain, and I don't think anybody really truly knows. But there is certainly reason to believe there are other kind of variables there, and there certainly are lots of things about the brain that we're still figuring out, just in terms of basically how it works on the level of kind of neurons and neurochemistry. So I think that there is no question that computers are moving towards a point where they will be able to do some very smart things and reason, in a human-like way at a very high level, beyond just playing chess and doing kind of complex things like that. But will they be self-aware? That's the point where I just don't think throwing more and more faster and faster, smaller and smaller chips at the problem suddenly gets to a threshold point where suddenly they do become self-aware. But it's going to be, I hope I'm around to see what happens. It's going to be incredibly interesting, as long as they don't take over.
Professor, vamos para mais um intervalo e voltamos já já com a entrevista de hoje, que também está sendo acompanhada aqui na plateia por André Passi, jornalista e professor da PUC do Rio Grande do Sul, Ana Brambila, jornalista do Núcleo de Internet da Editora Abril, e Luciano Castro, gerente de marketing da Jorge Zahar Editora. Até já!